my first book that I wrote is really history, and as far as music is concerned, because it's about the history of 20th century vocal music. And for me, the challenge in that was that if you're writing about history, you better know what you're talking about. And you better check your facts. And that a lot of that book was just an incredible amount of research to make sure that dates were correct and people were really in the place that I said they were at a certain time, or that a piece of music was actually performed the way that it was, and to describe it in ways that not only people could understand, but that coincided with any kind of publications that happened at the time. So there's just a whole lot of research that goes into writing history that would not necessarily be done with some other kinds of writing. And that constant fear for me that you're going to get it wrong, that somebody is going to read this book and say, gosh, this, you're really coming at this from the wrong place. And I guess that some of it would depend on what kind of history you're writing. Are you writing a biography? What are you doing? I was writing more, what had happened in music from a period to a period. And so in that, there's just a lot of minute detail that happens all along. It has to be logical. I think that's the other thing in writing history, is that you can't sort of go from here back to there and over here and over there like we can in some other kinds of writing. It has to be a progression. And some people are really good at that. I read some books that, for instance, one I mentioned a minute ago, the Judith Tick book, was just one of the best history books I've ever read about American composers. But she managed to, in her book, not just talk about these composers, but talk about the time period they lived in, and incorporated them within the time period that was almost like a novel. And that's a different kind of historical writing than what I do. So I think history can be approached from a lot of different angles, but I find it much more time consuming. You're in the library a lot. You're really working on detail a lot, and constant checking of details. And even after you've had people read things 1,000 times, there are still errors. When the book came out, and I don't know how many people read this book, there were 5 glaring errors in dates that we had checked 1,000,000 times. When the paperback came out, I fixed them. But when the original book came out, those dates were just, I don't know how they got in there, because they were just simply printed wrong, and we just didn't catch it when we got the galleys. So those things can happen. And in a historical book like that, that's really important. That it may sound like a minute thing, but it's very important.
You have to have a lot of eyes on it.
Uh-huh.
That know
A lot of eyes, yeah. I had several people reading this as I was doing it, checking facts, and I think it's good to have people reading things as you're going along, because they can tell you whether you are being logical, whether it makes sense. I've had people reading both of these books that I've written. I had 6 people reading the one I have just written, and they were all singers. They were all musicians, telling me whether they thought this was the kind of book they would want to read. And I think that's helpful, because people can tell you, this doesn't make sense, or I'm bored here, move on, we don't want to hear any more about this. And I try to find people who will really be honest and say, enough already.
You try to find people outside the music world?
In the 2 books I've written, yes. In both cases, I don't know, some of you may know Dr. Edwin Irwin.
Yes.
Edward. Edward, yes. I just call him Ed. He has been an editor on both of my books, and he is not a musician, but he was an English professor at Austin Peay, and he has read both of them and has made wonderful comments as to construction, grammar, just the flow of it, and so forth. He's probably the only one who was not a musician who read either book, but I've had musicians at least 5 or 6 read both.
So would you say it's programmed for the music world?
The first one was. The second one is primarily, although I belong to a writers group and none of them are musicians, and I've been reading the book to them, they've read it all. And they actually have told me they feel the book has things in it that would fit anybody. It basically is how to get along in the world and not crash.
One of the things we had to do for the exhibition was to take an object, a vintage object, and write from that. And that's, I think, a little bit similar to writing about history, even though it's not a specific historical period. But maybe if you participated in that, could you talk about what that was like as far as writing about? It's a combination, really, of the last two topics, the muse and history.
I could have gone in different directions with the object. It was a vintage first, and I thought about that, and I thought I can do some research about this. But I was really inspired by the object itself and the size of it, and of course I came back to the personal, which is, it wasn't anything that my mom would have carried, or my grandmother, because it was tiny. And I thought, my mom has a football. She has to keep up all these like keys for the farms, and like, this is not, I mean, like, this is like some idea that we have of women. This is not like what women really use, because all the women in my life, this is not exactly speaking to them. But it's carrying on this like beautiful romantic notion that you could just like let everything go and be reduced to like lipstick and a mirror would fit in. You know, and so this is a nice idea, and so we're kind of like selling that. But then as I started thinking about it, I thought of so I was letting the object carry me, not the history in that case. I do occasionally follow research. The research is an incredibly inspiring and creative, prompt for me. But I haven't read anything historical per se. Other than I write about Emily Dickinson, but I don't think that it's not historical or scholarly research that I'm doing. I'm doing close readings of her work, so I don't think of it in those terms. But mostly I was just letting the object carry me back in the past to the story.
I like writing narrative poems about stories I've heard. I don't think that's history, but it's maybe similar to what you did with the objects. But I'll hear a story or pick up from a conversation, and then I like to take that beyond its original history. And so that's very inspiring. That's a muse for me, and I just enjoy that process of taking a piece of history and stretching it.
Yeah, very well.